Listen closely. On Christmas night, while candles flickered and hymns echoed through polished halls, a teenage girl carried a flame through a mansion built on stolen lives. She was not a ghost. She was not a legend. She was a decision, one that would erase an entire bloodline before dawn. Tonight, you're not hearing a story. You're entering a psychological threshold where obedience collapses and power changes hands. Picture this: 1853, Virginia. Snow falling like a quiet confession over tobacco fields soaked in human suffering. Inside the Whitmore plantation house, crystal glasses clink, silk dresses glide across mahogany floors, laughter rises like smoke toward painted ceilings. Outside, enslaved families huddle in drafty quarters, wrapped in wool that barely keeps the cold out, stomachs empty, lungs burning, dignity erased. Celia is 18. She has watched her mother bleed for this house. She has watched friends sold like livestock. She has watched hunger hollow out children. And tonight, she overhears something that fractures her mind forever. Her master calmly discussing cutting rations again, letting the weak die to save money. Not hatred, not rage, accounting. At that moment, a realization detonates inside her. She is already condemned. Her people are already sentenced. The system is designed so that obedience equals slow death, so she chooses a different ending. She lifts a candle, not in prayer, not in fear, but in certainty. As she walks the silent corridors, portraits stare down, generations of men who built empires on bondage. Curtains imported from Paris brush her fingers. Rugs worth more than her entire community's lives soften her steps. Everything here exists because people like her were reduced to numbers in ledgers. And in that moment she understands something that modern men rarely confront. Systems do not collapse from debate. They collapse when someone breaks the psychological contract of submission. She touches flame to silk. The fire rises like a revelation. Curtains ignite. Tapestries vanish. Books burn. Volumes praising liberty while endorsing chains. The house becomes a living entity screaming as it realizes it is mortal. This is not revenge. This is rebalancing power through irreversible action. As the Whitmore family sleeps upstairs, believing themselves untouchable, the structure that defined their supremacy becomes their coffin. Wealth, lineage, morality, none of it matters now. Fire is the only law. And Celia doesn't run. She walks deeper into the blaze, fully aware that this single act will fracture reality itself, not just for this family, but for every man who believed power was permanent. Upstairs, they wake to smoke. Not the kind that drifts gently from a hearth, but the choking kind. The kind that invades lungs, burns eyes, and dissolves illusions. Panic rips through silk sheets and warm beds. Children cry. Footsteps collide. Doors fly open. Privilege meets terror for the first time. This is the moment every empire pretends will never come. Master Whitmore, the man who owned 67 human beings like cattle, runs through his own hallway screaming orders that mean nothing now. His authority, once absolute, has no jurisdiction over flame. His wealth has no leverage over heat. His name has no power over physics. Fire is the most democratic force on earth. It does not care who you are. It does not negotiate. It does not recognize status. It only consumes. And that is the psychological truth hidden in every civilization. Systems feel eternal until they meet a force that doesn't participate in their rules. Downstairs, Celia moves with intention, not chaos. She burns the account books first, the ledgers, the records, the proof, the architecture of ownership, the paper gods that turned humans into inventory. She doesn't just destroy a house, she erases the documentation of domination. This is strategic rebellion, not emotional reaction. The kitchen burns, the dining hall burns, the parlor burns. Each room represents a lie. Civilization, culture, order, tradition, all of it fueled by invisible suffering. Above her, the family is trapped. Windows won't open, staircases collapse, escape routes vanish. The mansion becomes a vertical tomb. The same walls that symbolized protection now function as a prison. And outside, something even darker happens. The enslaved community wakes. They see the flames. They hear the screams. They smell the burning wealth, and no one moves, not because they are cruel, not because they are monsters, but because something inside them breaks. For the first time in their lives, the hierarchy is inverted. For the first time, the powerful are helpless. For the first time, the masters need saving, and no one answers. This is the forbidden psychological layer history avoids. Oppression doesn't just destroy bodies, it trains obedience into the nervous system. It teaches people to protect the very structure that kills them. But tonight the conditioning fractures. Some stare in silence, some weep, some feel fear, some feel relief, some feel something they can't name. The children cough first. The mother clutches jewelry instead of sons. The father pounds glass with soft hands that never learned real labor. In their final minutes, the Whitmores learn what history never taught them. Control is an illusion that works only while everyone agrees to believe in it. Their house was never just wood and velvet. It was a psychological fortress, a symbol that told the world who mattered and who didn't. And now, that symbol is collapsing inward. Celia watches from the study doorway as beams crack and ceilings bow. The fire isn't wild, it is surgical. It moves through the house like judgment with a blueprint. She hears their voices, once confident, now desperate. She hears commands dissolve into pleading. She hears prayers form for the first time in their lives. And here is the forbidden truth no textbook will say out loud. Power teaches entitlement. Suffering teaches clarity. Celia has clarity. She remembers the ledger where her name was written between a plow horse and a butter churn. She remembers the casual discussion of letting people starve. She remembers her mother's hands cracking in the kitchen while the family debated dessert flavors. This is not hatred. This is moral arithmetic. And outside, something even more dangerous is happening. The enslaved workers begin to understand something that cannot be unlearned. The system is fragile. The masters are mortal. The house can burn. This realization spreads faster than any fire. A system survives on psychological dominance more than physical force. Once the myth cracks, obedience becomes optional. Fear becomes negotiable. Resistance becomes imaginable. That's why authorities fear symbols more than weapons. Inside the inferno, Celia doesn't scream. She doesn't cry. She doesn't pray. She becomes something rarer than a rebel. She becomes a narrative rupture. When the roof collapses and the Whitmores vanish into smoke, the era they represented dies with them. Not legally, not officially, but psychologically. The next morning, investigators will call it an accident. Newspapers will call it tragedy. Politicians will call it inconvenient. But every enslaved man and woman who saw the flames will call it something else. Possibility. And possibility is the most destabilizing force in any system of control. Morning arrives, but clarity does not. The mansion is gone, reduced to ash, twisted silver, and a single chimney standing like a tombstone for a system that believed itself eternal. 5 bodies are found, 1 is missing. Celia. No corpse, no bones, no trace. And that absence is more terrifying than any confession. Because power structures can handle violence, they can punish rebellion, they can execute rebels and make examples of them. What they cannot handle is uncertainty, especially uncertainty that inspires imagination. Sheriff Crenshaw walks through the ruins and sees what no report will admit. This was deliberate. Accelerants, strategic ignition points, footprints in the snow, bare feet, calm steps. No panic. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculated psychological strike. But he also understands something darker. If he tells the truth, he will ignite something larger than a house fire. He will ignite an idea. So the system does what systems always do. It lies. The official report, unattended candle. The newspapers, tragic Christmas disaster. The elites, silence. This is institutional manipulation in its purest form, manufacturing reality to preserve control. Truth is not suppressed because it is false. Truth is suppressed because it is destabilizing. And Celia becomes a ghost. Not in the supernatural sense, but in the cultural sense. A story whispered in quarters. A rumor carried along plantation roads. A symbol passed through songs, prayers, coded phrases. a girl who walked into fire and walked out of history. And halfway through this descent, I need you to understand something personal. This story is not about slavery. This is about what happens when an individual rejects the identity imposed on them. So comment this phrase twice. The fire remembers. Type it again. The fire remembers. Because identity is built through repetition, and repetition rewires the mind. Celia's disappearance becomes the seed of something uncontrollable. Fires begin to appear on other plantations, always targeted, always precise, always destroying records, wealth, symbols of dominance, always leaving behind a strange detail, a circle of unburned ground with a brass key in the center. Authorities call it coincidence. The oppressed call it a network. The masters call it terror. But psychologically, it is something more dangerous. It is proof that the oppressed are no longer psychologically captive. When fear dies, systems collapse. The fires spread, but not like chaos. They spread like intelligence. Winter after winter, plantation houses burn with the same signature. Strategic ignition points. Financial records destroyed first, personal luxuries consumed, no enslaved casualties, and that impossible detail. The untouched circle of floorboards, the brass key resting in ash like a message. To the elites, this is not rebellion. This is contamination. Because rebellion can be crushed, but contamination spreads through minds. Plantation owners stop sleeping. They listen for footsteps. They imagine servants moving through hallways at night. They stare at curtains and see fuel. They look at ledgers and see liability. Their greatest fear is not fire. It is the realization that the people they control know their weaknesses better than they do. This is the hidden architecture of domination, intimacy. Oppression forces proximity. Proximity creates knowledge. Knowledge creates leverage. And once leverage exists, the psychological balance shifts. Banks hesitate to finance plantations. Insurers refuse coverage. Politicians exchange private letters filled with panic. The economy built on bondage begins to tremble, not because of laws, but because of fear. Fear reverses hierarchy. A master who is afraid of his servants is no longer a master. He is a hostage to the illusion of control. Abolitionists amplify the legend. Writers weave it into novels. Speakers turn it into sermons. Celia becomes myth, symbol, warning, prophecy. Whether she is alive or dead no longer matters. Symbols are more powerful than individuals. A person can be killed. An idea can infect millions. And this is where the deeper psychological manipulation emerges. Authorities deliberately choose silence. They erase reports. They falsify conclusions. They pressure coroners, sheriffs, journalists, not to protect the public, but to protect the architecture of obedience. Because if men understand that systems collapse when individuals break psychological contracts, they might start breaking their own. Celia is no longer a girl. She is a mimetic weapon, and every man who hears her story feels something uncomfortable, a question forming in the subconscious, a realization that obedience is learned, a suspicion that power is fragile. The fire is no longer in Virginia. It is in the mind. Years pass, but myths do not age the way people do. They don't wrinkle. They don't weaken. They evolve. Celia's story mutates as it travels. In one version, she is a runaway who founded a hidden settlement in the mountains. In another, she is a traveling preacher who teaches coded rebellion through hymns. In another, she is no longer a person at all, but a name used by many women who strike in silence. This is how legends become movements. Psychologists call this distributed identity. When a symbol becomes larger than an individual, anyone can wear it, anyone can become it, anyone can continue it. So when a plantation burns in Georgia, they whisper, "Celia was there." When records vanish in Louisiana, they say, "She came back." When a master disappears in South Carolina, they claim, "She finally collected the debt." Whether any of this is true is irrelevant, because truth is not what shapes history. Belief does. The elites begin to notice something terrifying. Enslaved workers no longer lower their eyes. Songs change. Stories shift. Children grow up hearing a different mythology, not of submission but of consequence. Myth is a weapon, and this one is aimed upward. Meanwhile, Celia, real or imagined, has already achieved the impossible. She forced the powerful to think like the powerless. She forced masters to feel surveillance. She forced certainty to become paranoia, and paranoia destroys empires faster than armies. In private letters, plantation owners confess nightmares. In diaries, wives write about hearing footsteps that aren't there. Men who once believed themselves gods now pray not to see smoke on the horizon. Power was never just wealth, it was psychological dominance, and that dominance is gone. History books will not tell you this. They will list laws, wars, speeches, dates. They will not explain the invisible collapse, the moment when obedience stopped being automatic. But in the quiet between fires, in the stories passed in whispers, in the songs with double meanings, one message persists. Systems fall the moment people realize they are imaginary. Celia didn't just burn a house, she burned a belief. And beliefs, once destroyed, never rebuild the same way. But every myth has a shadow. As Celia's legend grows, so does the counter-myth. The elites understand something crucial. You cannot erase a story, but you can rewrite it. So they begin to reshape her. In newspapers, she becomes a deranged arsonist. In pamphlets, she becomes a demon possessed by chaos. In sermons, she becomes proof that rebellion leads only to destruction. This is narrative warfare. Whoever controls the story controls the future. So they turn Celia into a warning instead of a symbol. And it works, partially. Some enslaved people hesitate. Some families fear retaliation. Some communities pull back. The myth fractures into two versions, the liberator and the monster. Division is the oldest weapon of power, but something irreversible has already happened. People now understand that myths can be built, that symbols can be engineered, that fear can be redirected upward. The realization spreads quietly. If one story can destabilize an empire, what could thousands do? Celia becomes less important than the template she created. A template of psychological resistance, a template of symbolic rebellion, a template of narrative disruption. And decades later, when laws change and chains fall on paper, historians will celebrate politicians, generals, and speeches. They will not mention the girl who burned a mansion. They will not analyze the mimetic shockwave that preceded legal change. They will not admit that systems often collapse in the mind long before they collapse in law. But the oppressed will remember, not as a saint, not as a villain, but as a rupture in the story of inevitability. Because the most dangerous idea in any hierarchy is this: nothing is inevitable. And somewhere in the ashes of history, a brass key still exists, not to open a door, but to remind the world that every locked system has a weakness. The brass key becomes legend. No one knows where it came from, and no one knows what it unlocks, but everyone understands what it means. A key is a promise. A key is a threat. A key is proof that something once locked can be opened. Years later, a young boy on a distant plantation hears the story for the first time. His grandmother whispers it like a prayer and a warning. She never met Celia. She never saw the fire, but she knows the rhythm of the tale so well that it feels like memory. This is how cultural DNA works. Stories become inherited instinct. The boy imagines the mansion burning. He imagines Celia walking calmly through smoke. He imagines the masters screaming. And in that imagination, something changes in him forever. Fear shrinks. Possibility grows. He doesn't plan rebellion. He doesn't plan escape. He only plans not to believe in the system as deeply as his parents did. And that small psychological shift is how revolutions actually begin. Meanwhile, the elites continue rewriting history. They publish textbooks. They sanitize language. They replace enslaved with workers. They call plantations estates. They transform brutality into economics. This is psychological laundering. If you clean the language, you clean the conscience. But Celia's myth resists laundering. It remains raw, emotional, destabilizing. It refuses to become polite, and that is why it survives. Polished stories comfort. Uncomfortable stories awaken. Decades pass. Empires fall. Laws change. Flags shift. Yet the pattern repeats in every era. People in power build systems, people at the bottom internalize those systems, and one day someone refuses the script. Celia becomes a universal archetype. She is the factory worker who leaks documents. She is the student who refuses propaganda. She is the citizen who stops obeying unjust rules. She is not one person. She is a psychological event that repeats throughout history, and every time it happens, systems tremble again. In the end, Celia is never found. No grave, no trial, no confession, and that is what makes her immortal. History prefers clean endings, a villain captured, a hero celebrated, a system reformed. But reality is messy, and power hates messy endings because messy endings leave questions, and questions are dangerous. So the world moves on. New laws replace old chains. New hierarchies replace old masters. New mansions rise where old ones burned. People convince themselves that the fire was just history, just a story, just something that can never happen again, but the pattern never disappears. Every generation produces a Celia, not always with flames, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, sometimes with a single act of refusal that cracks an entire system. The true ending is not in the ashes of the Whitmore mansion. The true ending is in the mind of anyone who hears this story and feels something shift inside them. Because once you realize that systems survive only because people believe in them, you can never unlearn it. Celia did not burn a house. She burned inevitability, and inevitability is the strongest chain of all. So when you see smoke on the horizon of history, when you see people challenging structures that once seemed permanent, remember this story. Remember the brass key, remember the girl who walked through fire and into myth, and remember this final truth. Empires fall when belief falls, chains break when the mind breaks first, and the fire always remembers.